So let's go ahead and run through the classic sphere rolling down an indent kind of shot. We get to do a little bit of modeling, talk a little bit about some of the dynamics that's going on, and we'll look at two examples mainly to use some default splines to do this kind of modeling, as well as doing something more custom as we see on the previous shot, and also have a little bit of fun with these fun bump maps in here, and hopefully end up with a kind of cool sci-fi looking, nice looking shot. So the nuts and bolts of what we're doing here is essentially leveraging the bool object, which allows us to take two things, two pieces of geometry. So in this case, sweep NURBS. And so basically I have a base cube and I'm subtracting from the cube 3 sweep NURBS. So if you're familiar with these tools, this is going to make a whole lot of sense. And there may be different ways to go about this, but this is the way that I am approaching it to pull it off for these purposes. But there's a couple of things you need to know and be aware of to get the simulation set up and working correctly. I'm just going to go ahead and start a new project. First thing I'm going to do is add that cube, and it does need to be a cube so that we have kind of a larger piece of geometry to work against. And really quick, I'm just going to take the default arc spline, go ahead and turn it on its side, come to a top view. I like the general size that we have right now, but we'll just go ahead and move this into place and kind of perfectly cut across. And I'll actually make sure it ends up right about there. Now from my front view, I'll simply kind of drag this to the top. I'm going to hold down Alt and select a sweep NURB to make it apparent of that arc. Then I'm going to go back to my spline menu, grab a circle, into the sweep NURB, turn it way, way down, and then I'm going to see that I'm using the sweep NURB to create a second piece of geometry. I'm going to turn on shading and lines, because the question of how much geometry we have on each object is going to be really important for setting up the scene. I'm going to grab my entire sweep NURB, and I basically want this to rest at about the halfway point. And wherever we position this sweep NURB is going to really control how much of a dent we're putting in and how deep we want this piece of the geometry to be. Now I'm going to duplicate the sweep NURB because in my example, I actually had multiple pieces. So I'll pull that one there, and then I'll move this one, actually move this one back a bit till they're evenly spaced. I'm going to grab all 3 and just make sure that it's entering and exiting on these same sides here. And I'm just going to kind of eyeball this and make sure everything's flowing together. Now, as I said, how deep these are is going to be important. If we go too deep, we're going to start to curl the top of the geometry back, and that's going to look a little bit silly. We want it to be really clean, so we want it about 50% or even more than that. And you could get even a little bit more subtle and just barely put an indent in. And this is where you can get a bit creative. I'm going to go kind of just below 50% there. So I'm going to put my 3 sweep NURBS into a null object so that it's acting as kind of a single object in the browser here. And then I'm going to come back to the subdivision surface menu where the bool object is located, grab my 2 objects, place them in the bool, and I should see that work correctly. The order of these is incredibly important because if we select the bool object and look at the attributes, you'll see the boolean type A subtract B. And there's A union with B, A intersect, A without. By default, it's A subtract B, so A being the cube, B being the null objects with our sweeps, and so it's subtracting from that top layer. Now, the nice thing is everything is still working and live, and so we can make any tweaks to our design here. And I can see on this first arc here, if I can find it, that I might want to actually scale that down a little bit and move this back into place just so that I'm keeping that angle looking a little bit more consistent. And this one here, I may actually want to scale up. I just want these curves to look a little bit more consistent than I had it there. Now, if I take a look at the sweep NURBS, I think I'm going to want to up the geometry to make sure that these shapes are smooth. Now, that issue is actually being driven by the arcs themselves, by the spline. So if I select all of my arcs and I look at the attributes, by default, the intermediate points are set to uniform and it gives us a number of 8. And this is basically kind of a subdivision slider. And if I take that down, you'll see these angles become more extreme. And it's basically asking how smooth we want these arcs to be. So instead of 8, I could take it to something like 16 and start to, really clean up that spline. And I want to do all this work before I take this boolean and make it editable and crush this geometry down. So we want to look at that here at this point in the process. So with everything looking good there, I'll just call this cube 01. I'm going to make a copy of it. I'm going to turn off the second copy, and I'm just going to hold this as a backup. And with this one selected here, I'm going to hit C to make it editable. And that actually created multiple pieces of geometry, which is not what I want. I want to grab those pieces of geometry, select all of them, come to the object menu and say connect objects and delete to create a single piece of geometry. Now it created a whole bunch of texture tags that I actually do not want, texture selections. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those. For now, I will leave the Fong tag and the UVW tag. That's okay. I'll delete this null object. And so now we have a single piece of geometry here that we can use to build out the rest of our scene and do the simulation. So I'll go ahead and add a sphere to the scene, come back to my 4-panel view. I'm going to first just take my segments from 16 to 64 so I can just up the level of subdivision there and kind of match what I'm doing in my scene. I'm just going to start placing this and then trying to scale it so that it fits really comfortably within this gap here. And I can kind of look around. Now, I'm finding as I mess around with this technique that, the overall size of this is really going to determine how much collision noise and back and forth we're going to get as this ball starts to roll. The larger I make it, the less kind of collision noise I'm going to have, and I should get a slightly smoother roll. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. Now, when it comes to doing a dynamic simulation, if I am intersecting this geometry, that's going to be a problem. So I want to make sure that these are not actually touching, but they're very close. And to get the ball rolling here, so to speak, I'm going to come to my cube. I'm going to go under my tags to the simulation tags and call this a collider body. On the sphere, I'm going to go back to those same simulation tags and call it a rigid body. Now, I'm going to take my timeline up to 500 frames so I have some more time to look at this simulation, hit play, and you're going to observe the first issue that we need to solve for, which is this thing jumps in the air and starts coasting along. So what we need to do is within the collider body tag, under the collision attributes, where it says size increment set to 0, there's a checkbox that says use, and if we click it, it activates what's a margin. So I wish I knew to understand why this works better, but when I go back and hit play, now I'm seeing it's not jumping away, it's literally just sitting on the surface, which is what we're looking for. So if you're getting that poor kind of collision spacing, tick that over to using a margin of 0 as opposed to the size increment, and that seems to work better. Now, when I hit play, this sphere is just kind of sitting here, and there seems to be a bit of friction and collision that's happening to create a little bit of movement, but there's no forces in the scene. So I'm going to go to the Simulate tab and add a wind force. And now we're going to see there's some movement going in our scene. And this is going to help us choose directionally. Right now the wind is blowing this direction. I'm going to go ahead and rotate that 90 degrees. Come back to my starting point here. And it's moving a bit quick, so within the wind attributes, I'll just take this down to something like 1, so I can do this a little bit slower. And it's going to pick up speed and still move pretty quickly, even at that speed. And I could kind of maybe do a camera move and track along with this. I'm going to take my scene size down to 200, given the size of my cube here. So the next thing I could do is just kind of have some fun with this scene, add more spheres. I'm going to go to this top view so that I don't affect anything on the y-axis. I'm just going to move basically the x and the z from this perspective. And I'll try to offset their location a bit. Go ahead and add just a little bit more to look at and play with in terms of spacing. Go and hit play. So we see that initial kind of settling, and then all the spheres start to roll. So it's really as easy as that, right? Getting the modeling down, getting the simulation set up, and getting some forces into the scene. Now, just to have a little bit of fun and dress this simulation up, I'm going to create a nice texture here and play around with its bump map. And I'm going to add a noise into the bump channel, and I'm going to click on the noise so I can go in here to its attributes, its properties, and I'm going to choose cell noise, which is basically almost kind of like a pixel art pattern. Take the contrast up to 100. I'm going to go through and apply this very quickly to each of my spheres. Within the bump basic properties here, I'm going to take the strength up to 100%. We can see we start to get this fun little kind of sci-fi ball texture going, which is cool. And within the color channel, I'm going to add a texture. I'm going to add a gradient. And I'm just going to do a kind of top to bottom gradient here. And this is where we can have a little bit of fun and add some color to this scene. And I don't want this to actually be a gradient. I want it to behave a bit more like a hard line down the center, just so I can see my roll a little bit better. And now we can see a little bit of that motion there just by having a texture like that. On reflectance, I'll just add the slightest bit of glossiness to these because I think that's kind of fun. I will blur that out just a little bit, roughen it out. I'm going to copy and paste this texture, come back in here and clear out the gradient and just take this to a slightly brighter value and then apply this to my cube. So that's kind of fun. Now, the actual material tag on this cube, I think I'm going to go ahead and click on this material, bring up its attributes, and within its bump map, just go ahead and take the global scale of this thing way up, maybe more like 500%, just so it feels like maybe a slightly kind of distribution of these bump map lines. And this is where you can kind of play as well. And sometimes you have to navigate around again to kind of see you're updating and just kind of creating a fun look. Now, I think I'm going to go ahead and add a camera to the scene. I'm going to keep the camera angle decently wide. I'm just going to start right here at the beginning of this simulation. Hit play. I'm just going to watch this play out a bit. Stop it right about there. Come back and reframe my second camera position. So we're going to do this kind of thing and track along. And then a third camera position that looks basically straight down because it's kind of fun to watch those. So go ahead and hit play and see how we're doing. Yeah, so super fun technique. Now to light this scene, I'm just going to use the physical sky. And that right off the bat, if I go into time and location, it's looking extremely kind of warm and directional. That's because it's saying it's a winter sky. It's a December sky. If we take that to the middle of the year, it's going to look a heck of a lot different. But I think we're at the point now where we can turn on the interactive render region and see how we're looking. But I am going to go into my time and location and just try to make this a little bit later in the day because it's looking a little bit hot. And then the next thing I'm going to do is hit R, and with the physical sky selected, start rotating this until I sort of place the shadows where I want them in the scene and where I want that specular highlight to exist and where we're going to kind of push these shadows. So if I go ahead and render this out real quick, I'll see that the bump map isn't really behaving as dramatically. It's not catching these faux kind of patterns of light on the spheres like it is on the cube. And that's because we need to make these spheres editable. They're still parametric objects. And so if I go ahead and grab all of them and hit C and convert them to objects, now when I watch this render, I should see a vastly different result in terms of this bump map and the way it's being distributed here on this object. And we start to see that. We're starting to see these lines come in here. And we can go ahead and take this down a bit now. If we take this back to something like 100 and then wait for an updated render here, and I'll go ahead and turn down render samples so it's a bit quicker. I'm even going to take this to a global scale of like 20%, make it way smaller, and see where that gets me, because these spheres are obviously much smaller than the cube at large here. And so now we're getting some more interesting effects, which I think is cool. Seeing a little bit more of this line work is certainly helpful. Now I am going to use global illumination in the scene here, and that should create that nice light bounce. It's going to brighten up these dark values and just make the lighting look slightly more realistic. And I'll go ahead and hit play and kind of see. Now, because I made them editable at that exact point where they were sitting, I'm going to want to just actually quickly rearrange these one last time. And again, I'm going to make sure I use the top view so that I don't disturb anything in the y-axis. And I can have my front view open to see that I'm not making that adjustment there in random spots. But the nice thing about making it editable while it was in the middle of a simulation is that now they're a bit randomized in terms of rotation. So that's kind of fun as well. So if I go ahead and hit play, I'm going to see camera moves along, the spheres are rolling. The bump maps look funny just here in the viewport, but when we actually go to render it, it should look a little bit better. And I can see I just need to extend this out a bit, so there's a little bit more room to watch this simulation run. And actually, we'll take that up to about 300 frames. So at this point, I'd probably be ready to kind of turn my settings, my anti-aliasing up. If I was going to do a render with actually a second global illumination bounce diffusion to create even a little bit more realism in there, go ahead and turn my output up to 1920 1080. I am going to render pretty heavy 16-bit PNGs, so I can do a bit of color grading in After Effects after the fact. But for the most part, that is about as far as I decided to take this scene for this example. Really fun, easy technique to set up. The other example that I did, again, I want to run through that quickly. I'm going to bring up a cube, make it a little bit larger. I'm going to go to the spline pen tool, and I'm going to create more of a custom sweep NURB instead of just using an actual default. And so I'm just going to quickly set this up and very carefully try to create some nice rounded corners that are a little bit forgiving. And then I'll just run this all the way down here. Now I'm going to hit escape. And that's all I need to do, right, is create that. And then if I come back and grab another sweep NURB and another circle spline, we can rebuild what we were doing there. The circle spline is going to be way too big. It's also oriented incorrectly. Take it to XY, scale it way, way down. Go ahead and grab the sweep NURB object and bring it up to the surface. And this is how we can actually create more custom paths, right? And the spline is going to stay live, which is really helpful. I can come to this top view, and if I actually filter out what's called generator, then I'll only see the spline. I won't see what the spline is generating, right? The sweep NURB is generating geometry, and it's not yet an editable object. So this is where we can actually kind of affect how we want this to behave. And of course, this is one design. You could, of course, do all sorts of designs, do maybe just more flowing shapes like so. Just doing perhaps straight lines, some kind of straights against curves. So wherever your starting point is, you can kind of start with these spline designs. Then again, go back to this technique of using the Boolean object to carve into a cube and have a little bit of fun doing that. And if you create your Boolean and the cube disappears, what I find is that it's like a bit of an error where it's kind of the angle of the spline is actually messing with the ability of the bool. So if we take that angle down, actually we see the cube reappear. And I find this to be just kind of an artifact of working with live splines and the bool object. There's probably a better explanation than I'm giving you here, but at any rate, you can definitely get it to work if you just adjust the attributes a little bit. Now, this top spline, we'll see, it's basically going to cut off wherever that is right there. So if you want this to run all the way to the end, it needs to move to the end. I can straighten it out here a bit if you want it to cut all the way through. But of course, continuing to work with live objects is really nice, and you'll see it actually kind of flickers as I'm messing around with it here. But it does appear to work. Now, again, before we go and create a simulation out of this, we are going to have to make this into an editable object. But I would definitely advise always keeping a backup within your scene to be able to just go back and quickly make any tweaks if you find you need to do that. So I came into After Effects, added a little bit of color grading just to punch up the colors, the vibrance, the sharpness, the saturation, using a default Lumetri color effect on an adjustment layer. And then here under the Creative tab, I can make some adjustments in terms of fading out the blacks a bit, sharpening the image, adding some vibrance. And I also did punch up the exposure a little bit. So for me, that's as far as I'm going to take this experiment. It's a really fun technique, obviously incredibly popular, all these spheres rolling down all these pathways, but maybe you can find some original and creative uses for combining these tools and techniques in Cinema 4D. You can check out more about MoGraph Mentor. We've got Cinema 4D training, 3D, 2D training, all that great stuff. Check it out at mographmentor.com. And for now, we'll say thanks for watching.